Okay, well, I make that 8 o'clock, so I guess we'll get the ball rolling. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan. I'm currently chair of the Roman Army School. So, on behalf of the entire organisational committee, I'd like to welcome you along to our first ever webinar. We're really excited to be branching out into online lectures, and we hope that this will be the first of many. So, thank you for showing your support and coming along to hear us tonight. Tonight's lecture will be given by Professor David Breeze, who I'm sure most of you will recognise from his work on Hadrian's Wall. And tonight, David will be talking to us about reconstructing life in the fort of Bearsden. There will be a short questions and answer session after the lecture. And in order to ask a question, there is a tiny bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen that has 2 little speech bubbles that says Q&A. If you type your question in there, we'll be able to ask the questions at the end of the lecture. So anything you would like to ask, just put in the box and we'll see how many we can get through at the end of the lecture. With the little bit of admin there just out of the way, I will now be quiet and hand you over to David to begin our lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. If you can't hear, let Ron know in some form. Thank you for joining us this evening. My street has started celebrating Christmas by having everybody to switch the lights on to cheer us up and drink a glass of mulled wine. So I've only had 2 glasses of mulled wine so far. I want to locate you first. This is the Antonine Wall running from Oakhill-Patrick, just northwest of Glasgow, through in the west to Carradon in the east on the Forth, and here is the fort at Bearsden. I spent 10 summers excavating on the site of the fort, and the areas we were able to look at are all in light grey, and the buildings that were on the site when we started are dark grey. Part of the problems of why this is a very strange plan of excavator drive here, but there were protected trees on alongside it and along the road and various areas which were inaccessible, swimming pool and so on. So it's a very funny plan. The fort was established under Antoninus Pius, top left, and the original plan, which was never finished, phase 1, had a headquarters building at the center of the fort, 1 granary to its left, and top right, the bathhouse had started being built. The plan was then changed, and the big fort divided into 2 and annex with the bathhouse to the right, and to the left we've got various buildings of the actually occupied and used fort. The plan looks rather strange, but in fact it was very carefully laid out. Overlying the fort now is a grid, and each square is 120 feet square, which is a Roman actus, and you can see the line on the north side is the outside of the ditch, the east side and the south side, the outside of the ditch, and the outside of the 2 ditches on the west, suggesting the outer one's an additional one, which would make sense because it's no slope on this side. Right through the center of the fort is 1 line, and the fort itself, as you can see, is half an actus in from the outer line, and then within it, all these long buildings are exactly an actus long. So it's very carefully laid out. That's significant in one way. I'm mainly going to talk about pottery tonight and what it can tell us, because the finds of metalwork were really very poor. Lots of bits of shield binding, a hook there, stray bits of metalwork. These are, to the right, the best finds, especially bottom are arrowheads which were dumped in the fort ditch when the site was abandoned, which appear to have never been used. And we've got 2 pilum heads, which it is usually said is in the fort. So I'm really going to be talking mainly about the pottery, and we're looking at a collection here in the middle at the top and bottom right are mixing bowls, mortaria. We'll come back to these later. Here is a cooking pot, and below it a bowl, and top right is a jar. You'll see the significance of these shortly. While I was writing up the excavation, I came across this British archaeological report by Ricky Giles, who's an American but did her work at Newcastle. And Ricky came up with a wizard idea of acknowledging that when we dig a Roman fort, we very rarely dig the whole one. So what she did was to put forward, put together for the 1st century and the 2nd century, and then more generally, the evidence about specific numbers of forts, 16 or 17, where we had quite a lot of information in order to work out which finds you were more likely to find in which types of buildings. And this was enormously helpful as I was trying to look at the evidence, similar evidence for Bearsden. So what I'm going to talk about obviously is the 2nd phase in the fort. And what we have is the original headquarters building here, a granary, a 2nd granary, more excavated, buildings which we don't understand down here, and long, narrow buildings in the northern part of the fort. The 2 that I'm specifically going to look at were clearly Barrack-blocks. The plan of the buildings proclaim that. So these are the 2 buildings I'm going to look at. And I'm looking at 2 issues. One is what happens in each Barrack-block, and why, and well, if and why the finds in these 2 Barrack-blocks differed from those in the other 3 buildings of similar size, but different internal arrangements. Now, the first thing is we're going to be looking at a series of plans of the fort with marked on it the distribution of different types of pottery. So here, top left, we see a mortarium, a mixing bowl. And you can see the distribution of these throughout the fort. The bigger the dot, the more, until we get to ones like this with a cross, where we have an awful lot. But this area inside the fort and in the annex here were both used as dumps. So you get a lot of pottery there. And the most significant fact, if you look at the Barrack-blocks, in nearly every room, there are fragments of mixing bowls. And not quite so many here. There's a gap because we didn't excavate that area, but then we come into them again at the far end. Compare it to this building. Now, I know there are vagaries. This was towards the top end of the site. There was less stratification surviving, so perhaps that could account for less. But the crucial thing is that there are just not mixing bowl here. We excavate very few. If we move on to cooking pots, top left again, and again the Barrack-blocks, even better distribution. Practically everyone here has a cooking pot or more in it. And quite a few in this Barrack-block, whereas up here, very few throughout this building, a little more up there, none in that. And finally, in this group of material, bowls, top right is what we're looking at. And again, in nearly each of these rooms, there are bowls, and again, a similar distribution of here, over here, but none in, well, apart from one group there, none in the rest of the building, just you know, the west and east end of that building, and none in the one next to it. Now, the other aspect is what we didn't have. That's important as well. So in orange I beg your pardon, I'm sorry, I've messed this one up. In yellow plates, I beg your pardon. So we've got plates down here. We found quite a cache. We've got plates in this area. There's actually even one in one of the rooms in the headquarters building. We've got a few over here. We haven't got a single plate in these 2 Barrack-blocks, not a single one. There's other types of pottery up there, vessels, but again, just one in there, but throughout the Barrack-blocks, none at all. So my guess is quite simple. In each Barrack-block, the soldiers are preparing their food using the mixing bowls, they're cooking it, and they're eating with their fingers because we've got bowls or dishes and not plates in the Barrack-blocks. It's obviously a hypothesis, but for my money, I think it's quite a good one, strong one. The other aspect is the type of pottery and the cooking of it. So what we found at the bottom are evidence for braziers. Probably 3 braziers. This is the best one. And I've put on the top of that a bowl or a dish rather with a saggy bottom, which is a technical term, of course, to indicate a pottery vessel which would sit on the knobs which are sticking up. And if it was flat, of course, it could slide off. If it's got a saggy bottom, it would sit on top for cooking. And if you have been to South Shields and looked in one of the Barrack-blocks, at the back of this slide on the table is a recreated brazier of just the type we've got at Bearsden. Now, the interesting thing with these is that this is not cooking in a British style. It's a North African style. And for 20 years, several of us tried to work out why it was that we had this North African influence at not just at this site, but others along the Antonine Wall in cuisine. And the month following the publication in 2016 of the final excavation reports, this fragment of a diploma was published. And in red, I've outlined BAE-TAS-IOR. It's the Cohors Baitaziorum, which we know was based on the Antonine Wall at Bar Hill. And the regiment behind it is the unit of Batavians with a suffix which we don't have parallels for. But these 2 units, which are in Britannia. So this actually relates to soldiers being discharged in North Africa. The rest of the document tells us that, but there are units serving there which came from Britain. And here at Bar Hill, in the center of the slide, is the site where the unit, the first cohort of Baitasians, was based. And Lawrence Keppie, when he dug it in the 1970s, discovered in the kiln inside, next to the bathhouse rather, in the furnace chamber of the bathhouse, there was a kiln making pottery in the North African style. So it looks as though soldiers, not just from Bar Hill, but from Bearsden, at some point during occupation of the fort, had served in the army, campaigning in North Africa in a war which we know occurred during the reign of Antoninus Pius, and came home with these newfangled cooking styles, whether it's because they personally picked them up, whether they'd brought wives back with them or slaves to cook in this particular style, we don't know. That's one we can't answer as yet. Ricky Dials was also very interesting when it came to jars. So here we've got the distribution of jars, some in Barrack-blocks. This is a road, a touch on the road in a granary, roads again, road up here and up there. And Ricky said, and with bottom left, we've got a jar. And Ricky said the distribution of jars is very interesting. You tend to find them in granaries or on roads. And it's as if soldiers used them to collect grain or water. And as they were toddling their way back to their barrack block, they tripped up, dropped their jar, and the sherds were left lying on the road surface. And that is very similar to the pattern we've got, as you can see. The upper class pottery style is Samian, imported from Gaul. Quite a bit of that across the fort, as you can see, and also the annex where the bathhouse is, which we'll come back to, outside the fort to east and to west. But what's interesting is the distribution again. So none in this building, apart from a little one or two pieces at one end. There's a few in there, but few in there. But look, this is the officers' quarters. Good chunk in there. Oops, sorry. Good chunk in there. Just one in a barrack block. A couple of pieces there. And in this area around the officers' quarters, again, quite a lot of Samian. None in the headquarters building, as you can see. So, I mean, it looks as though what we're seeing here is pottery which is used by the senior officers and mainly not by the men. Glass is interesting too. All the glass sherds are small. You can see these at the bottom. Quite a few, here again, we've got them in the officers' quarters at each end. And we've got them through this barrack block, odd sherds roundabout. But what's interesting about glass, and it's detailed in the excavation report by Jenny Price, she said that it's very possible that because glass was recyclable, the pieces survive in small bits, as it might be, put in your hand carrier to go off, possibly to the fort at Camillon along the wall, for recycling into some new use. And that's why the glass vessel fragments are small. They're ready, broken up to be reused. Amphora wine jars. Incidentally, we had 4 different types of amphora. 2 for wine, 1 for fish sauce, 1 for olive oil. Coming from different places. And differentially spread in the fort. So the pink here is where we had most amphora. In this area too, around a building which clearly is not a barrack block. I don't know what it is. I wondered whether it's a small storehouse. Green, well, I've lost my point of green here and in the barrack blocks. And not much much in most of the barrack blocks. It's just left me wondering whether, in fact, bearing in mind the lack of most other types of pottery and glass in this building up at the top end, whether what we actually had there was a storeroom for wine jars. These have to be stored somewhere, just as firewood has to be stored somewhere under cover. But you never hear any Roman archaeologists talking about where they kept the firewood. Now let's move on to the bathhouse. Sorry, I'll just go back. This is the annex on the right-hand side of the fort, and in it is the bathhouse. We're looking north. Unfortunately, all my pictures are looking in different directions. So this, we're looking south, and we have at the right-hand end the changing room, cold room, first warm room, second warm room, hot room with its own hot bath here, furnace. We use red Lanarkshire gravel to try to draw attention to this would be heated furnace. You'd walk all the way through here, and this corner, there was a bench still standing when we excavated the site. And back into the cold room, sort of central room. If you didn't want to go to the hot dry treatment, the sort of hot treatment, sorry, the steam bath, the Turkish bath, you could go into the sauna here, where again, we've got red Lanarkshire gravel trying to simulate heat, raised floor again, in that manner, and whichever treatment you went for, you then take a dip in the cold bath to close up your pores before you go back into the changing room to put your clothes on and follow that path, and it leads you to the fort. Down here is part of an earlier bathhouse. I think it had been constructed with a roof on even, because it was of stone voussoirs, and every one of them was damaged when we found them over this area. But right in the middle here, on top of the clay, which had not been dug out for the basement, unlike there you see, the clay's dug out, was a hearth. So it looks to me as what happened here, the plan changed. They started off intending to have a bathhouse down bottom left. They changed their ideas. They used it as the mess room while they were building the rest of the bathhouse, a new bathhouse. Then they demolished that, and they used the stones from this in building this room and that room, because these are a different type, different dress stones from this part of the bathhouse. Finally, please note the latrine, which is over here, flush with water from here coming down this drain, and from 1, 2, 3, 4 drains coming out of different parts of the bathhouse to flush the latrine. Now, we'll swivel around again. We're looking north. This is what the complex makes look like. We found no evidence here for tiles or slates on the roof. So we've adopted a oak shingle roof. However, in the latrine at the bottom, we did find rushes inside it. So we've taken the jump that these were rushes from thatch in the roof. What we looked at again here was a distribution of different types of pottery. I'm only going to show you 2 slides. One is just interestingly the number of bowls in this area, bowls and dishes, in the cold room, the first warm room, the hot room, and dotted around it as well. When we come to Samian, however, look, there's Samian in every room, apart from the changing room here. And what's interesting is we had only 2 fragments of cups, top left, but we had 8 fragments of bowls like this. Now, why should that be? It was very problematic to us, and I thought hard as to why you find so many bowls in a bathhouse. Well, perhaps they were used for drinking out of. If I could show you, I'd take a sip of my mulled wine at this stage. So here we've got a depiction of a drinking party, and you can see this lady's imbibed too much. She's been propped up by her slave, and this one's got a really very large bowl, like the one we've just seen in her hand. Perhaps they were piss pots, they were jerrys, they were chamber pots, whatever you want to call it. Well, you might think, would this be the case? But when you come to look at the plan of the bathhouse, by the time you get to the hot room at the east end of it, and you decide you needed to go to the loo, you've got to come back into the next room here, across that, right the way across the cold room, out of a door, which I think was here. There's evidence for a door there, along the path to the latrine, and then back again. So you can imagine there might well be chamber pots in the latrines. And here is in the bathhouse, I beg your pardon. Here's a latrine. Just here's a little joke at my expense. When we originally wrote this, prepared this drawing, Mike Moore gave the soldier a sponge on a stick, because there is some evidence, not a lot, but people cleaning themselves using a sponge and a stick and poking the stick through there to clean themselves. We were very fortunate at Bearsden that one of the team looking at the botanical remains was an internationally famous expert in moss, and he found a lot of moss in the sewage, and he came to the conclusion that in fact what was happening is they were using the moss to clean themselves. I'm told it takes 25 years for a new fact to get into a school textbook, and it's about coming on for that, the use of moss in a latrine at Bearsden is getting into the archaeological textbooks. So when we first published the main excavation report, we suddenly raised, we use the old drawing with a soldier with a sponge on the stick, and for the popular account, which came out a month later, we changed it, and that's why he's clutching moss. However, I had this random thought, what else would you use large bowls for? I mean, nibbles? Well, would you in the bathhouse? And then I took another look at the botanical report and discovered we found fragments of fruits and nuts in the bathhouse. And I thought, well, QED, that's as good a suggestion as any. We've got evidence for drinking out of cups, and we've got evidence for taking your nibbles out of bowls. So that's what we think would have happened in the bathhouse at Bearsden. It's often said that the games of dice were played there. Well, we did find a gaming board, but not in the bathhouse, alas. However, did find other fragments. I mean, this is just the bathhouse. In here, Brian Dobson, I know Anne's with us tonight, found this head of a goddess, possibly Fortuna, who protected men when they're in their most vulnerable state, i.e. when they had no clothes on. And outside, or perhaps just on the inside, one of the rooms was this fountainhead with the water coming out of the spout. So there's a bit of architectural pretension here, in spite of the thatched roof. We shouldn't judge a book by its covers, perhaps. Well, back to the pottery. What's interesting is where it all came from. So right in the middle, and here are mixing bowls, and this one at the top, I think this is turned now upside down, and you can see Sarri for Sarius, who had two pottery manufacturing centres, one in West Midlands and one in South Yorkshire, and clearly sent up one of his workmen to Bearsden to make pottery. And we found a fragment of one of Sarius's pots, vessels, in the very, very earliest level, which is the hearth inside the primary bathhouse of phase 1. So clearly the manufacturing manufacturer had come up in the wake of the army straight away. Otherwise, what we've got to the left is the top pot is made in Dorset, the bottom one possibly in Colchester, the bowl, whereas the jar up here has come all the way from Gaul, from North France, just like the Samian ware as well. So a wide distribution of material coming in the form of pottery. Food also came from a distance. Wheat, Western Scotland is in a great wheat growing area. It's wheat pericar. That's come from probably southern Britain. Whereas these are fig seeds, which have gone through the gut of a Roman soldier and were found in sewage, and they would have been imported like the opium poppy and the coriander from the continent. Here again are fragments from the sewage, and here's a psychotic fly's wing in the center of these wheat fragments in the sewage. So when we look at a distribution, we see that soldiers at Bearsden are recipients of a lot of material coming from abroad. So we've got a lot of pottery vessels here, Samian from Gaul, ordinary, the pot we've already seen from up here and there. Quern stones from Germany. Various commodities from the Mediterranean coast, including wine in bottles rather than amphora here, olive oil down here from Spain, and interestingly, and fish-based sauce, and interestingly, bottom left is olive oil, is wheat, beg your pardon, wheat. Now, when we examined the residue in one of the cooking pots, we found that unlike the other wheats, which was spelt and emmer, this was Durham wheat, otherwise known as macaroni wheat, used in making pasta and pizza. Its DNA was South Spain. And there is a reference to Augustus chastising the governor of this area, known as Baetica, for not getting his wheat exports out on time. So whether there's a link, I have no idea. It was just a nice coincidence, perhaps. But you can see the vast distribution network bringing food and goods to the soldiers on the northwest frontier of the Roman Empire. When you excavate, you're always left with a series of problems, and this is just one of them. So we found pieces of glass of a jar, glass jar, and on the base was an inscription. This top left, we're looking at the bottom right piece here, and the man is Asinius Martialis, who made this vessel. Presumably he was the maker of the vessel, who is otherwise not attested anywhere. So just watch this space. Someday somebody will produce another glass vessel made by Martialis. That was just one of our threads left hanging. How did the fort end? How did life for these soldiers come to a full stop at Bearsden? Well, first of all, there was a lot of evidence for burning. Wherever we went, the gutters were full of burning. Sometimes here, the rubble from the granary lay over burnt wattle and daub for the barrack-blocks. Absolutely clear that the fort was leveled. One fragment of glass you've already seen was burnt in this conflagration. The range of finds we found was very interesting. Hardly anything of any quality. What was left was the dross, the rubbish, like the shield boss. It's bashed, it's got a hole in it. You can see clearly it wasn't worth taking with them, so they left it. The querns were the same, fragments, really well-used querns, which were not worth taking away. Amongst the very few items which were, you would think, of some value, were the arrowheads dumped in the fort ditch, which is a usual place by the gates as you march out across the causeway. You just toss everything into the fort ditch. This is interesting, a group of arrowheads, because they're a very unusual design with no parallels, and none of the people who are experts in arrowheads can tell us what they were used for. It's been suggested they might have been hunting, special hunting arrowheads, for example. The site was then left just abandoned. When we came to excavate it, on top of it, you can see buildings here, and this were a series of large Victorian villas. And this one was built on a plat of clay, which you can see here. Sorry, and once we got the clay off, you can see immediately below the turf here was the surviving remains of the barrack-blocks. This corner, nine courses high, still surviving, and here several courses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 courses surviving immediately below the turf work. And that was, if you like, the second phase was the Victorian buildings. There was nothing between the Romans and those buildings. Well, you have to produce a report. This was published early November in 2016 in the Hunteria Museum, where I managed to persuade Anton Muscatelli, the principal of the university, to launch it. It was a very political event for me because I invited 100 archaeologists, including many from his university who dug there, many from who'd done the work on the finds, were all there crowded round their vice chancellor and principal, which was important because there had been not long before a move to scale down the archaeology department in the university. So I wanted to show the principal that we're alive and kicking. The gingerbread, the gilt on the gingerbread, the next day was that we had the cartoon in the Glasgow Herald. And I'll leave you to look at that. The empire is falling, Waitrosium are out of figs. When we put together the press announcements, we focused on the exotic elements. The figs was high on the list, as you can imagine, as was the Durham wheat, the macaroni wheat. So the other headlines focused on pizzas at Bearsden. And there we are. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, David. It was a brilliant lecture. We have time for some questions and answers now. I already have two that have come in, I can see. So first question is from Linda Davis, and she would like to know which sites apart from Bearsden would you recommend to visit on the Antonine Wall?
That's very simple. I have a set tour if I've got a whole day. I start off at the east, just beside Bowness, on the Firth of Forth, and there laid out is the remains of a fortlet. Back in the car or the coach, drive westwards to the fort at Rough Castle, which is just to the west of Falkirk. There's the earthworks of a fort and its annex to see. Good section of ditch. Lilia, that's the pits in front of the fort, quarry pits, and a section of road all to visit there. Back in the vehicle, westwards again to, if you've got a really good day, you can walk over Croy Hill and Bar Hill together. You'll pick up good sections and stretches of ditch, beacon platforms, the fort at Bar Hill with a bathhouse and headquarters building on display, and then on westwards to Bearsden towards the west end of the wall where there is the bathhouse to see. It's a good day. Everything is well worth seeing.
Excellent. Oh, I've got a couple more questions coming in now as well. A question from Helen. She says, I know the Antonine Wall was not occupied for very long, but is there any evidence for local manufacture of pottery, glass, metal, and other such?
Not at Bearsden. We did have an anvil, which is suggestive of metalworking, repairing perhaps of some kind. That's about the best I can do. And they would appear to have, well, the glass I've dealt with, but lots of bits of metalwork as if they were saving them, perhaps like that shield boss, for not necessarily repair, but reuse in some form, melting them down and reusing them. But on the Antonine Wall, generally speaking, there is very little evidence for local manufacture. Most of the stuff seems to be imported. And we know in the 4th century, you know, a couple of 100 and odd years on, that the Roman army had arms factories specializing in different types of weapons and armory. But that's about the best I can do, I'm afraid. Okay.
Following on from that one, I have a question from Steve Honeysett, which is actually one that I'd thought about myself, which is the Bearsden assemblage typical of Antonine Wall forts?
Oh, that's a very good question. The answer is, on the whole, yes. in fact, I got Lindsay Allison Jones to look at the assemblage and compare it to the rest of the Antonine Wall material. What is interesting in Roman Scotland is, just think of Hadrian's Wall. Which site on Hadrian's Wall has produced all the goodies? Begins with a V for a clue. And in Scotland, Newstead, dug 1905 to 1910, produced enormous amounts of goodies. And Strageath, which is north of the Antonine Wall, dug by Shepherd Freer and John Wilkes, not quite so good, but still a good range of goodies. The Antonine Wall, for some reason, on the whole, has very poor finds assemblages. They're poor, as you've seen at Bearsden, because they're clapped out stuff and just abandoned because they weren't worth taking away. But it's poor in numbers and quality. It's as if, and the reason why this question is important, it's as if the army had time to knock down and demolish and burn its own buildings. And I should have put a slide on of the 5-foot strip of burning outside the rampart, which I assume is a breastwork, which was thrown down and burnt when the fort was abandoned. So we've got evidence that the army did it themselves in that way. And they had time to take away what they wanted to do, which means that he wasn't overwhelmed by the Caledonians, but was a peaceful evacuation.
Wow, excellent. What else have I got? I have two small questions here from Yorit, who says, thank you for the great talk, but was there any exploration done of the area outside of the walls, and are there traces of extramural activities? And were animal bones found, and if so, what kind? Well, very little in the way of animal bones. The pH level was 5.6, which meant that most bones had been destroyed. There's I think a one-page report on what I thought could have been Roman ones as opposed to modern ones, bones. So that's pretty general for the Antonine Wall. Not a lot of bones survive. It's a great shame because it's one of the things we want to know about, obviously. Civil settlement, yep. Many years, well, 40 odd years ago, I wrote a research strategy for the Antonine Wall. And one of my aims was to find out more about civilian life on the wall. And of course, so two areas, well, we looked at an area to the east of the fort and found nothing. We looked at two biggish areas to the west of the fort, and we found two sections of clay and cobble foundation. And at the end of one of them was a pivot hole. So assuming this wasn't coincidental, it looks as though it was a doorway there. And we could have had a lean-to buildings leaning against a stone building or a timber building, which was based on this clay and cobble foundation. And we did, if Yorit looked carefully at the tree to the, in this area as well, Samian as well. Now, immediately south of the fort, south ditch was a very steep slope running down to the flat ground below. And I put one area in there and found nothing. And I looked, there was a university lecturer lived in a house at the bottom of this slope. And he allowed me to dig his 2 trenches in his garden. And the only thing we found there was a disused 20th century boiler, which had been buried in his garden. We were a bit worried, we thought it was a bomb, but it wasn't, it was a boiler. So we found no pottery at all there. So south, we were extremely unlucky. The only thing we got, which was any way suggestive, was west of the fort. Can I say, sort of to continue on with that for a moment, this is again not uncommon. It's led Lawrence Kepi 10 years ago to look at all the evidence and suggest that perhaps there weren't very many soldiers based in the forts along the wall.
and possibly the families gathered together in specific civil settlements rather than outside forts, all forts. The jury's still out. The other aspect we have to bear in mind is that there could have been families inside the forts. Again, there was nothing specifically which said here that this might have been the case. They did find women and children's shoes, but appeared to come from the commanding officer's house. New evidence, in particular from one of the legionary bases in Germany, is interesting. If you look at the next current world archaeology, I recommend it to you if you don't normally get it. There's a paper by half a dozen of us looking at how Roman soldiers found their outposts. Did turrets on Hadrian's Wall have names or numbers? How can we work this one out? And amongst the evidence we looked at is from Vindonissa, where we have what appear to evidence for at least one woman in the fort, because it refers to the house of our hostess. And there is other evidence for a lady called, I think, Bellica in the fortress. So we also have to imagine that it's very possible that the families of soldiers were inside the forts.
Yes, it'd be interesting if we could find a definitive answer to that, whether they lived in the forts or not. But I think more evidence required there. What else? I have one.
It's a big.
Sorry, I have.
No, I was just going to say,
final question
at the moment. Right.
Sorry, I think my connection may have dropped out there. One final question from Jeff Cambers, who would like to know: was the Antonine Wall attacked?
Well, we don't have any evidence. It's as simple as that. And I don't like making evidence up, if you'll forgive me. For a start, when Hadrian, for the last year of his life, was ill. I would argue that this made him take bad or unusual decisions. So the first decision he took was to get rid of his nearest relative. It was his great nephew, had him killed, obvious potential successor. He then chose another man to succeed him. Bad choice. He died before Hadrian, who had absolutely no military experience. This was the man we know as Antoninus Pius. The first thing that Antoninus Pius does, and I mean the first thing, he becomes emperor in July 138, and he's got to sort out the succession, taking over, deifying Hadrian, getting him buried and all of that. And then by the following summer, which is the first available opportunity, the Roman army are preparing themselves by rebuilding at Corbridge, preparing themselves to move back into southern Scotland. They do that. There's absolutely no evidence that there was any serious warfare which occasioned this move. And I think we should bear that in mind. I think it was totally political measure. Just think of Isabelita Perron, or was it Galtieri, shelling the unarmed Endurance in the South Atlantic. It was just to give her better poll ratings, that's all. And dictators like to do this, and elected prime ministers as well, watch this space, have a foreign adventure to take people's eyes off what's happening at home. And what came out of this was not just conquering southern Scotland. It was the only time as emperor that Antoninus Pius took the title of imperator, conqueror. There's a new book come out, new study of him, which emphasizes that in every year of his reign, practically, there was fighting on his frontiers. So it wasn't as if there weren't occasions when he could have become a conqueror again, but it emphasizes the single importance of what he did in Scotland. But there's no evidence that there was a necessity on the frontier to do it. So he becomes emperor. He gets his triumph, just as Claudius did. Suetonius said of Claudius, he needed a triumph, so he conquered Britain. And then it does seem to me, from all the evidence, and I've looked at this more than once over the years, that the evidence is that the withdrawal was not in the face of a rampant enemy. It was measured in peaceful conditions, as it were. What happened in between is difficult to say, because we simply have no commentary on the Antonine Wall, apart from the very first one, which was dated to sometime between about 142. That Lollis Urbis conquered that Antonine Aspires conquered the Britons through his general Lollis Urbicus and built a new wall, that of time of turf. But nobody says when it was abandoned, why it was abandoned, whether it was attacked, and there isn't any evidence in the form of burning that we could take into account, in burning in forts, I mean, that we could take into account, which would suggest that there had been attacks. Even if we had burning, it's actually very difficult to interpret. Did a soldier get, think of those charcoal braziers. A soldier has a few too many with his mates in the next door barrack block. He comes back, kicks over the brazier and sets his barrack block on fire. I mean, how are you going to distinguish that sort of burning from any other sort of burning? So there are lots of archaeological issues of interpretation, which I'm sure Susan can support as well. There is, and I've taken a long time to say, there is no evidence that the Antonine Wall was ever attacked.
I have one final comment that's come through from Vicky Harley. She said that she's not entirely certain of the link between eating with fingers and a lack of plates in barracks. And she cites a time that she visited India, where she'd noticed local people eating off plates with their fingers and managing to do it very neatly. So perhaps lack of plates is not necessarily just due to eating with fingers.
Yeah, I totally accept that. Yeah, I'm trying to make up a story. Archaeologists these days are told we've got to create stories. Isn't that right, Susan? Yeah,
we are. Yes, tell the story of the site.
And I'm very happy to be disproved. I mean, we didn't find knives, you see. The forks hadn't been invented. We didn't find knives. We didn't find spoons. And it just seemed to me a bowl is a very natural thing to eat out of. And it did explain the lack of plates. But it is only a hypothesis. But thank you for that. I haven't been to India, so now I know better.
Well, that's everything as far as our questions go. I don't have anything else coming in, so I guess we've reached the end of our first lecture here. So if you've enjoyed it and you're not on our mailing list, please do sign up to it. You can reach us through our website, which is ad43.org.uk. I'm sure our webmaster will correct me if I'm wrong with that. If you are signed up to our mailing list, we'll be sending out a final round robin mailing e-newsletter just before Christmas, which will include the details of this lecture and hopefully what we want to do in the new year, and the usual roundup of articles and books to read and other things. So I think that's us all done for the evening. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a brilliant experience to do this first lecture, and we hope to do more in the future. So
Good night.
I think we can sign off now.
Okay.
Okay.
Cheers, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Ron.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.